In my opinion, Sony's always had a weird way of innovating cameras, from their twisty bodies with strange sensors, much seen in my beloved Sony FA28, to their more later Alpha series, which seems to have paid off. And the Sony R1 is no different, and that's the camera we're going to be talking about today, my fanny pack rig. It's a beautiful fall day here in the Northland, so I thought I'd just capture the leaves and maybe do some diet wildlife shots with the Sony R1. I'm trying to get the birds before they migrate south. It looks like they've already started, so we still have a couple butts in the air and mallards in the water. I love when the mallards go butt up in the air. Oh, this is hard multitasking. One thing I really wish this camera had was a slightly longer zoom. I love that it's a Carl Zeiss lens, but I wish instead of 24-120 to at least go to 200mm. It'd be so much more useful. I should title this video Sony R1, just not close enough. Kidding aside, the R1 has a very serious lens. It's a Carl Zeiss that goes from 24 to 120mm. Not only that, it has a mechanically linked zoom, which is something you don't see in bridge cameras anymore. It has a very bright f2.8 starting aperture, which in theory should give you some pretty good low light shots, right? In theory. We'll talk about that in a little bit. On paper, the Sony R1 has some pretty unique and, dare I say, modern specs. I mean, I'm not talking about the 10 megapixel sensor, but in the day that was a lot. I mean, 20 years ago, a lot of cameras were maybe 6 to 8 megapixels, so 10 and a crop sensor added to that. The R1 here was the first camera with the live view, electronic viewfinder, live histogram, and this might turn some of you off of this camera here, but it is a CMOS sensor. I know it's not a CCD, but at the time Sony was innovating. And if you think about all of its competition around it, being CCD sensors, having a CMOS was pretty unique at the time. Now you're probably saying, Matt, why the heck would I pick up a CMOS sensor that's 2 decades old when I can get those nice, beautiful CCD colors that I've been looking for? Well, believe it or not, there is some advantages to having a CMOS sensor. CMOS sensors are generally faster to process and more power efficient than CCDs. And I find both of those things partly true when we're talking about the R1 here. I have a couple bones to pick with this camera. So before we talk about the brains of the R1, let's take a look at the body. Now, this was released in 2005, which is 2 years after our beloved FA28 was, but it doesn't share many physical traits with the older brother. Instead of swiveling on a hinge, it has an articulating screen, which, side note, I watch YouTubers complain about this because, oh, when I use it up, it might be a little bit distracting when I do street photography. But you know what this camera has? You put it down, an actual viewfinder, which is an EVF at that. So surprise, surprise, discrete photography if you want to use it at eye level, right? As we mentioned, it has a very nice Zeiss lens. And much like you'd expect a 2-decade-old camera to have, the R1 has a dedicated button for nearly everything. And where the screen should be are even more buttons. Now, although I do prefer the swivel body as seen on the FA28, I do like the R1 because I can use it hip firing like a medium format film camera. It also has that offset hot shoe, which is more natural if you're into flash photography and portrait work. Now, in tandem with the off-kilter hot shoe, the R1 also has a leaf shutter, which could also help your flash photography. I'm now interrupting this broadcast to show you some shots that I took at the end of the summer so you get a sense of what this camera can do with portraits and otherwise. Geese count as wildlife photography, right? And did you see that fish jump? A few things to know about the Sony R1 internally. It has a big honking 10 megapixel crop sensor. It writes to two different types of memory cards, one CF and one Sony memory stick, and processing raw files is a bit faster than the F828. Being that it has a big sensor too, they claim it has better dynamic range than our beloved F828. Now, these two aren't meant to be directly compared to each other, but you kind of have to since this was released a couple of years after, and a lot of people do see it as its younger brother. So let me just talk about some goods and bads when using the R1. Just know that for the most part, this is my opinion, so don't let me sway you hither or thither with this camera, especially with the negatives, because they're just more or less gripes that I have. For starters, having such a big sensor with the bright aperture, this camera is not that good in low light. I've seen people say you can use it up to ISO 400 with usable shots. I just can't see that. Pair that with the fact that there's no in-body stabilization of any sort in this, you're gonna have to have a steady hand or a tripod. Another thing is this camera just simply can't perform in cold temperatures to any degree, pun intended. I took this out the other night and it was 45 degrees Fahrenheit. You know, it's the turn of the seasons here in the Northland, so fall's among us, leaves are changing. Being it was 45 degrees, I took the camera out and I was only able to get 2 shots before the battery went kerplunk. So on the flip side of what I just said, the Sony R1 has great battery life if you use it within reasonable operating temperatures. And having a big sensor with an f2.8 aperture is great if you want background separation, which is pretty rare, all things considered, when we're talking about bridge cameras. Now let me explain. So first off, these batteries are incredibly common. Most of my video lights use them, and they're cheap. The battery life generally lasts about 350 shots in the old R1 here. And if we're talking about the big crop sensor, it does have great dynamic range for a camera of its age. They claim it has more than the F828, but honestly I do prefer the color science in the F828 over the R1. Please don't be mad at me, it's just my preference. The Sony R1 is a very innovative camera for its time and age. Having a very large 10 megapixel crop CMOS sensor, electric viewfinder, histograms, all within a bridge camera with the Carl Zeiss lens is very eye-watering and appealing to me. Now, although there is some shortcomings when it comes to low light performance, it's still a camera worth picking up. Now, do I like it more than the F828? Not really, but it's still a great camera to use with a big cult following that I hope doesn't start a fight in my comments, because it's still a great camera and I'm not hating on it. That's not to say this isn't great to use, especially with the little swivel screen, all the dedicated buttons that this old bridge camera has, and with its very sharp mechanically linked Carl Zeiss zoom lens. This is a great camera to pick up, especially if you find it at a reasonable price. So that's it for now. Thank you for watching. Sub to my Instagram and I will see you next time.